What's up, guys? Tim Little. Welcome back to Tactical Bassin. Today we are talking about summer worm fishing. Do you need to be throwing giant magnum-sized worms or finesse worms? I'm going to cover some of my favorite types of worms, depending on if you're throwing a Carolina rig or a Texas rig, but more importantly, summertime fishing and why you need to be throwing a worm this time of year. So I did this video around this time last year, and I actually talked about this worm right here. This is actually an Upton's Customs. This is a 19-inch worm, and believe it or not, you can catch a 2-pound bass on this guy right here. But several years ago, probably back in 2008, 2009, something like that, I went down to Lake Falcon in Texas, into one of the tackle shops down there, and they had rows and rows and rows of giant magnum-sized rubber worms. And I kind of laughed to myself when I saw them because, it's like when a guy that doesn't fish comes in and sees like an 8-inch or a 10-inch swim bait on your wall. They just kind of laugh at you like, what eats that? A shark? You get all those jokes. And so here I am looking at these baits and I'm like, what eats that? A shark? So kind of felt stupid, but there are some phenomenal baits out on the market right now that are considered magnum worms. And today I'm going to cover some of my favorite baits for worm fishing, how to fish them. I'm going to actually jump up in front of the camera and I'll show you guys how I work the different baits, the Carolina rig or the Texas rig or the Shaky head, that sort of stuff. But yeah, more importantly, why you need to be throwing a worm this time of the year. If you guys have been following along our videos, we kind of go through the different seasons, the different tactics, the different techniques and ways to catch them, where they go, where to look for them, all that sort of stuff is covered. But now you're in the dead of summer. It's almost July, right? It's summertime no matter where you are in the country. On the calendar, it says it is summertime. It is hot. It's typically the hottest time of the year. And to be honest, sometimes the fish do not want to cooperate. I don't know if you guys watched the Major League Fishing out here on Lake Chickamauga the last few weeks or so. But if you don't have the current running, during the day with the river and that sort of stuff, get those fish going, you have to figure out a different way to really get those fish to commit. You think about summer reactive fishing, you think about crankbaits, big flutter spoons, big jigs. You also need to think about worm fishing and big worms. So let's talk about the different styles of worms, and then we'll talk about the different ways I like to fish them and where they really shine in the different ways they're rigged up or fished. And then I'll show you how I fish them, because there's different ways to fish a ribbon tail worm versus a straight tail worm, so I'm going to cover that. But let's dive down into my favorite summertime worms, because there are probably hundreds, if not 1,000 different types of worms on the market. When you walk into a tackle shop, you probably see rows and rows and rows and pegs full of different soft plastic worms. So I'm going to try and narrow it down for you, make it simple, simplify it for you so you can figure out the different styles for the different things you're fishing, the different colors, and the different sizes. So I like to break let's call this a magnum worm video, because typically in the summertime I'm throwing large to largest or larger worms. I'm not throwing little 4-inch robo worms. I'm not throwing little drop shots. I'm actually fishing larger worms, and typically it's 8 inches or larger, 8 inches to like 13 inches. I actually keep this one just as like a collector's item, because people don't believe me that there are worms this big. I have caught fish on worms this big, and believe it, it was 2-pounder. So believe it or not, they actually eat that. So let's talk about the different categories of worms for me. And then, like I said, we'll show you how to fish them. But right off the bat, 3 categories. 2 main categories and 1 smaller category. First category is going to be your straight tail worms. These are going to be your worms that have fairly straight body all the way through. That's that man's jelly worm. Here's the Strike King bullworm. You can see they have a little bit of a bulbous tail on there, but for the most part, there's no ribbon, everything is the same all the way through the worm. There's no extra movement per se. Your trick worm. You know, that's just your straight tail worm, not really anything going on. And then you have your ribbon tail worms. You can see here what I mean by a ribbon tail. A lot more action. This worm is made to have action at real slow speeds. You can see all of this down here. When you're dragging this on bottom, that's all going to be moving in the current very easily. Whereas the straight tail worm, there's not much going on. You're going to have to get more reactive with your rod tip, the hops, how fast you fish it, the heavier heads, all that sort of stuff, and we're going to cover that. So that is your two main categories, your straight tail worms, your ribbon tail worms, and then that third category I kind of talked about is going to be some kind of wacky worm. This is actually a 10-inch stick bait by Magnum Baits, and just like every video, I will link all these products, favorite colors, hooks, all that stuff down below in the video description. But you can see that is a 10-inch Cinco, if you will, a giant wacky rig bait. I have that paired up with that Whack-A-Sack to get that bait down in the water column. But that'll be the third category, kind of like the wacky rig baits. But for the most part, you're talking straight tail and ribbon tail. Now, how do I know which worm to throw? It's fairly simple. If I am throwing a shaky head, let's see, got one of those rigged up right here. I am throwing a shaky head. Now this is actually the T-Mac worm right there. You guys know how much we love that. That is a trick worm style worm, but works really, really well. This one really stood out to us in our underwater footage out of all the straight tail worms that we use. So we've been using that that net bait. It's a T-Mac, and that is a normal, I think it's a 7 or 8 inch worm, but you can see that is a shaky head, right? Now the benefit of a shaky head, when you're hopping this thing, your line tie is right to the head of that bait. So every rod hop, every little reel twitch or pop, that worm gets real reactive. You know, I'm not going to be necessarily throwing a ribbon tail worm on a shaky head, so I go with a straight tail. Show you a little bit larger size. See right here, that is a Magnum shaky head. That hook is actually a Strike King, and I believe that's a 8 or 9/0 hook. Like I said, I'll link all that stuff down below in the video description. But there you go again, Magnum shaky head, Magnum worm. That is the big bull worm by Strike King. And then this guy right here. This is actually called the Wormster. I got that on that, that's this head right here. This is the Dirty Jigs. That's the Magnum stand-up head. But you can see that is a straight tail worm, although it is kind of cupped, so it's going to have more of like a paddle kick kind of action, and that works really well when you're hopping this jig. You know, it's summertime, the water is hot, these fish are moving around, so I like to get real aggressive with my shaky heads and my Texas rigs. So as I'm hopping this through, you know, the rock pile off my favorite point, I get real aggressive with the hops, and again, I'll show you how to fish it. But that cupped tail on that Wormster just really shimmies in the water and looks really, really good. So if I am getting aggressive with my bait, if I am fishing it fairly quickly, that is when I go with a straight tail worm. Now, if I'm going to be doing a slower dragging technique, either Texas rig or Carolina, that is when I go with that ribbon tail. You know, it's going to have a lot more, we'll call it secondary action. You know, when I'm hopping that rod tip, that worm is going up and down. When I'm just dragging the main bait, let's grab one for you. The worm is moving, but not only is the worm moving, now this tail back there is just fluttering, kicking along in the current with my drags. You know, yeah, I can pop it up if I come over a point or a rock pile, but it just gives a little extra movement to the worm. So you get a lot more movement even though you're fishing that bait slow with the ribbon tail. So again, your Texas rigs and your Carolina rigs. Those of you guys that aren't familiar with a Texas rig, the bait's gonna be rigged weedless. I like to run, I'm gonna talk about this a little bit later on in the video. I like to run a bobber stop ahead of my tungsten weight and then behind my tungsten weight. That way my weight isn't sliding down and hitting the tip of the worm or my knot every time I pop that weight up. So again, so you have that Texas rig. It's rigged weedless, back skinned into itself. So that is the Texas rig. And then a Carolina rig is going to be, typically you have your weight out in front of your worm anywhere from 12 inches to 4 feet. And then you have your weightless worm back behind it. This is actually the C-Mac. I talked about the T-Mac by NetBait. This is actually the C-Mac. Look how long of a ribbon tail that is. Let me show you this compared to that 12-inch Zoom Old Monster you guys know that I love so much. I don't know if you guys can see the size difference on that. But again, we're talking big worms today. So Carolina rig, obviously that is a dragging technique. You know, the benefit of throwing a Carolina rig is your weight is off of your worm. So when your weight is down on bottom and let's say you have 3 or 4 feet of line back off of your weight. So this is your weight, you got your worm back here. It's just free floating. You know, your weight comes crashing down, right? When you on your cast, your worm is just free floating. And as you drag or hop your weight, this just has a lot slower reaction time. So that is the benefit of the Carolina rig. You know, when that fish comes up and eats that worm, it doesn't feel the weight right at the head like you would on a shaky head or a Texas rig if it's pegged. So sometimes if you're throwing, say you're throwing a 3/4 ounce head on your worm, that fish comes up, it grabs the back into that worm, and now it's going to suck it up. It feels that 3/4 ounce. It feels the resistance, whereas a Carolina rig, it can come up and suck that worm in and until it starts to swim off or go a different direction to pull that, take that slack up between the hook and the weight. You have a little bit more time before that fish feels that bait. So now that we kind of talked about the different types, let's talk about wear real quick, and then let's jump up in front of the camera and I'll show you how to fish these, because some of them you drag, some of you hop. Like I said, I like to get real aggressive with my Texas rigs and my shaky heads. But when and where? When? All the time. You know, me personally, I like to start reactions, so I will start with my flutter spoons. I will start with my 10XDs, my 6XDs, my deep crankbaits, especially if I'm fishing ledges and there's current going. You know, say they're pulling some current and those fish are stacked up on the ledges. I'm going to go reaction 100% of the time. I'm going to start off there and see if I can get bit. I'm going to use my electronics, my side imaging, my down imaging, 360, kind of see what's going on, where those fish are positioning. And once I figure out those fish are not fired up, they're not active on the reaction stuff, that is when I go to the worm. You know, typically I will go with more of a reactive worm, so a shaky head or a Texas rig. And if that doesn't work, that is when I will switch and slow down and go with that Carolina rig or the slower Texas rig. So hopefully that makes sense for you guys. Where? Depends on the type of fishery you're in. You know, out here on the Tennessee River, you know, the TVA, you're going to be fishing ledges, you're going to be fishing points close to the river, the drop off, the break. That's where those fish are going to stack up, the mouths of creeks on that first break off of the backwater. As far as reservoir fishermen, highland or lowland reservoirs, you're going to be offshore. You're going to be fishing 10 to 40 feet of water. Typically those fish that are out deep, they're going to go deeper in the summertime with that warm water. So you're going to be looking for humps and rock piles. Look for that hard structure. You know, recently, Matt and I, we were down in Texas fishing falcon, and the pattern we were on, you'll see some of these fish catches in this video. You probably already have. We were looking for hard bottom. So there's a lot of timber in that lake. There's a lot of structure, if you will. But we were looking where that structure, where those trees were close to that hard bottom, so your rock piles, and that's where those fish were staying all summer. So again, some of those summer fish, they stay shallow, and that's where you're gonna catch them on your frogs and your topwater, your grass your grass baits. And then those fish that are going deep, that's where you're gonna really pick them apart with these worms. So that was when and where. Now let's talk about how to fish them. And again, just like every video, I will link my favorite worms, my ribbon tail worms, straight tail worms, the Magnum wacky rigs down below in the video description. I'll give you all the hooks and colors and such. Colors, let me just talk about it real quick because it's fairly simple. June bug is probably my #1 favorite summertime worm. For whatever reason, no matter where I go, it doesn't matter if I'm throwing a ribbon tail or a Texas rigged worm, June bug is it's just a color that gets bit year round, but is definitely a summertime color. Some kind of different versions of June bug. This is called Bama bug. It's kind of June bug on bottom, green pumpkin on top, but I keep it fairly simple. You know, either some type of June bug, some type of green pumpkin, black flake. Let's see. That's that squirm worm. Again, that's kind of like a plum with some purple flake in it. Again, we got, here's a good worm. Now that I'm picking up some of these worms, there's a couple that I haven't talked about. If you haven't heard of the Berkeley power worm, you guys have been living under a rock, because probably this one right here and the man's jelly worm were the first two for me Magnum worms that I like to throw. The man's jelly worm, it's been around for ages. It's just a big straight tail worm. I remember watching Paul Elias and the Bassmasters just smash mega bags on Falcon with this. And then the power worm, if you talk to anybody on the West Coast when they were night fishing, they were always throwing a 10 or 12 inch power worm. It just has that real good smell to it. A lot of people like to throw black. Summertime fishing, if you're fishing night, you can go with that. That's a completely different video. I don't want to go too much off of a tangent, but that is an awesome worm. Got one right here in green pumpkin as well. June bug, green pumpkin, stuff that's kind of contrasty. Either go natural or go contrasty depending on the time of day and your water clarity. If you can go natural, if you have really dingy water or stained water, go with that June bug or something that's very contrasty. Again, I'll link my favorite worms, and then I'll link some favorite colors to keep it simple for you guys. But we talked about the bull worm. Let's do the straight tail worms real quick. The trick worm. You guys know, if you've been a fan of the channel or been watching the channel, how much we love that T-Mac, that trick worm style worm. It just, the way the tail floats in the water is a lot more action. So we absolutely love that. And then that wormster, I think I have another one. Just grab this one for you. So that's all the straight tail worms. And then ribbon tail worms, that Zoom old monster. You guys know how much I love that. That was that main worm we were fishing down there on Falcon with that T-Mac, but the main ribbon tail worm was that old monster, either the 10.5 or 12 inch. You know, you guys don't have to go with a 19-inch worm your first time out trying to throw a Magnum worm, right? Go with a 10-inch worm or an 8-inch worm, something that is bigger than your traditional 4 to 6-inch drop shot worm. We talked about the bull worm. That comes in 2 sizes. Let's see. There's the 8 and the 10, I believe. Do I not have one? I know I got another one. Here we go. There's the 8. There's the 10. It's just all what you're comfortable with. You know, I will say, obviously the benefit of throwing the larger worm is you minimize the smaller fish. Yes, a 12-incher will eat this, but a 5-pounder is going to be more inclined to eat that than it would, let's say, just your normal 6-inch straight tail worm, right? So the bull worm's a great one. We talked about the man's jelly worm and the T-Mac. That's absolutely our favorite trick worm style bait. And as far as the mega wacky worm, or the Magnum wacky worms, Magnum Baits makes I think that's a 7 and 10 inch. This is the 10 inch right there. But that is an awesome wacky rigged worm. We really caught them well down south of the border, down in Mexico, fishing that right there. Actually wacky rigged on a jig of all things. But so that is worms simplified. Now I'm gonna move the camera, I'll jump up front and make some casts with a Carolina rig, a Shaky head, and a Texas rig, just to kind of show you how I fish them differently, and hopefully it'll give you guys some confidence to get out and try some of these worms right now. All right guys, got the camera moved around, got the rods ready. Now I'm gonna show you guys real quickly how I like to fish the different types of techniques and the baits, and then I got a couple more tips for you. So let's start off with this is a worm that you can go out and throw on you can throw it on a spinning rod if you want. This is just a traditional Shaky head. Again, that's that T-Mac. I have that paired up with that Dirty Jigs head. But this is a 610 medium action bait caster. You can get away with throwing it on a spinning rod if you don't have a bait caster. But summertime, the fish like to pull hard. They like to fight real hard. So I like to throw them on a bait caster if I can. Typically, I'm running braid to a mono leader. Typically, my leader is anywhere from 6, 8, 10 feet, depending on the depth I'm fishing and the water clarity. But how I like to fish this bait. Fire it out there, and we can pretend right here that, say, I'm out on a main lake point, and there's some chunk rock down at the end. I'm gonna fire this thing out and make sure I'm on bottom. I'm gonna hop, let it fall, reel up my slack, hop. 9 times out of 10 on that second hop, and I let the fall, that's when you feel the thunk. You reel down, check your rod tip, make sure you feel that weight there so they didn't just hit it and get off of it. So you feel the thunk, you reel down, you feel the pressure, that's when you reel down and jack them. But again, I fish this fairly quickly. You know, these fish are aggressive. They're not gonna take their time to really decide if they're gonna eat that bait or not. A lot of times they'll eat it on that initial fall. So you can fire it out there, let it fall. Now it's only like 6 or 8 feet out here right now, so obviously it's not very deep. But I'm gonna lift up and just check on the initial fall, because a lot of times on that fall, they'll suck it up and you'll go to hop that first time and you'll feel the resistance and then them pull off. So you just blew the opportunity of sticking that fish. So check it, nothing's there, kind of reel down, hop. And I'm not hitting it too hard. I'm probably popping this thing up 6, 8, 10 inches off the bottom, hop, and then letting it fall. Hop. You can just do a single hop. Well, here comes the wind, of course. But I like to do that 2-stage hop. It's just I don't know, personal preference. I don't know if it's like a hop and then a second hop, kind of like a jig, you know, like a crawdad shooting away. But again, I get very erratic and fish it very quickly. Now that was your traditional, just your normal size Shaky head. Let me grab one of the Magnum Shaky heads. Okay, so this is that Strike King head. That's actually a 3/4 ounce, and like I said, I think it's 8 or a 9/0 hook. Don't quote me, but again, I'll link it. That is that 12-inch bullworm. So same thing. Fire it out there. Now with the heads, get away with the lightest head that you can possibly get away with. That way you can feel that resistance of that bass. So if you're not fishing a heavy current situation, you know, maybe fish a 3/8 or a 1/2 ounce. If you need to throw a 3/4 or 1 ounce, then you can to get down in that current. But if you're fishing isolated cover, like a rock pile or something out of current, you know, I find myself trying to go with like either a 1/4 or a 3/8, because a lot of times with that heavy head, you get locked down and hung up in that rock. So you still want to be able to feel. That's why I like throwing the tungsten heads if possible. You get more of that feel. But go lighter if possible, because you won't get hung up as much. So again, on the fall, check it, nothing's there. Just kind of raise my rod tip, reel down. Now with the larger worm, you can just do a drag, just a single drag. Get that worm to up and then down. Check it, let it sit, shake it a little bit, hop. I don't get nearly as aggressive with the giant worms. You know, the 12-inch worms are bigger, because that's a big profile going through the water. Now the downside, if I want to just drag this worm, it's not going to have a lot of action because it has that straight tail. It doesn't have that ribbon down there dancing. So again, you want to, just like you would stroking a jig in summertime. You know, a lot of guys will throw a 3/4 ounce or 1 ounce jig on rock piles, just pop, pop, let it fall, hop, hop, you know, get that thing jumping and moving around, because you get those reaction bites just like you would with a crankbait. But again, I'm not letting it sit for long, and I'm not doing a lot of dragging. I'm just hopping it, checking it, popping it, and checking it. So that is how I like to fish the shaky head. Now I'm going to transition over to a Texas rig, kind of show you the two different ways I like to fish that. Now, backing up a little bit, little tip for you guys. I talked about it earlier. The benefit of a Carolina rig is the bait is not connected right at the top to the heavy weight. So that fish can come in, pick up that worm, have 2, 3, 4 feet of play before it feels the resistance of that 3/4 ounce, half ounce, whatever it may be. And you can do that with a Texas rig as well. And I like to do it depending on how aggressive or how quickly I'm fishing the worm. So this guy right here, that's that Zumo monster. Told you I like to run a bobber stop in front and behind my worm, just so that weight is not sliding up and down, bashing the face of my worm or my knot, weakening my line. But one thing I will do, if I'm getting real aggressive, say I'm throwing a Texas rig, but it's not a ribbon tail worm, say it's a straight tail worm, when I hop that rod, I want that worm to do exactly what my rod is doing. I don't want there to be any delay. If I go to hop a Carolina rig, I got 3, 4 feet of play before that line runs out, connects to that weight, and then the worm moves, right? So you can do that with my 2 bobber stop system. Say I want 6 or 8 inches of play. Benefit of that, my cast, weight goes down, now I have that weightless, free-floating worm. That's an advantage on the fall. Other advantage, down on the bottom, I'm dragging it, it's a ribbon tail worm. That bass comes in, sucks up that worm, starts pulling it off. Guess what? I just gave myself 8 or 10 inches of delay time to feel that bite, to feel that resistance before that knot hits that second bobber stop, and now that fish feels me. Guess what? We're using sensitive rods, we're using braid deleter, we're using sensitive stuff, but those fish are gonna feel you a lot of times before you feel them, so you gotta be on your game. So this gives you a little bit of play if you want it. Now, if you wanna get aggressive and be erratic, shorten up that, maybe only give yourself an inch or so. Shorten up that distance that weight can slide. So same thing, fire this out. I gave myself an inch or 2 of play between the weight. Gonna let this fall. This is actually a ribbon tail worm. So I'm not gonna pop it. I'm just gonna kind of lift up. Let that tail kind of swim up and swim down as it falls. I'm coming through that rock. I'm keeping constant bottom contact. I keep my rod tip, I don't know, 45-degree angle or so. I don't wanna be so straight up and, I feel like it's got a bit. I don't wanna be so straight up and down that I have nowhere to go on my hook set. Sometimes when you go to pull this thing up, they'll eat right here. That's when you got to reel down, give them some slack, and then hit them. But I'm not doing the hopping. I'm just kind of doing the lift. Just lift, let that thing swim up over that rock, and then fall back down. Just lift and drop it. Again, on that drop is usually when you get bit. Now, if you want to just drag, say you're coming through sparse chunk rock, maybe you're fishing a big flat before it breaks off on the river channel, then you're just going to kind of drag. That is where absolutely you want to go with the ribbon tail worm, because you get that action down there. And even if you're not doing anything with the rod tip or the rod, the current, just everything moving around down there is moving that worm just enough to get those fish to eat. So a little tip there on adjusting your bobber stops and the weight on your bait. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, leave some comments down or questions down below in the comments section. I will try to get to those. But I absolutely love that combo right there. Now let's talk about the Carolina rig real quick. Now most of these rods, I'm throwing a longer rod, 7.2 to 7.8, depending on the technique. Obviously with a Carolina rig, you got a lot extra line to deal with. So, you know, when you go to cast this bait, you can only have your weight right there. So the longer the rod, I don't know if you guys can see that or not, the longer the rod, the easier it is to cast the longer Carolina rigs. As far as the smaller shaky head, you can get away with a 6'10", 7-foot medium heavy action. If you're fishing a heavier weight, go with a medium heavy or heavy action. You know, something that has a real good backbone, because these summer fish, like I said before, they love to fight and pull, and you want to be able to get them in the boat. So as far as Carolina rig, little different cast. It's obviously a lob cast. You can't get real whippy with that long tail section. Fired out there. Now what this is doing, that bait's falling and hits the bottom, and that worm is just slowly falling down. It's just, depending on the worm type, it's just gliding down. Again, I'm just gonna drag a lot like the Texas rig, but I'm not doing the hop or the pull. You know, if I do come up to the edge of a rock pile, I might lift up and over it, but for the most part, I'm just dragging that weight. Very important, if you can, go with a tungsten weight. I like the Swagger Tackle tungsten weights. The benefit of tungsten, smaller profile, but they're more dense and more sensitive, so you can feel a lot more that's going on than your traditional lead weight. So a lot of times you'll be dragging nothing, tick, you feel, oh, there's hard bottom, there's rock. Now I'm gonna get bit. Now I'm gonna pay extra attention. I should be getting bit right now. So that's the benefit of throwing the tungsten. So if you can, they're obviously more expensive. If you can, go with the tungsten, but just dragging this 12-inch worm. Again, I'm throwing braid to leader. This is a 7'6" rod, and I'm just dragging. Now, one thing I haven't talked about, if you feel the dunk on some of these bigger worms, give it a second or two or three before you set the hook. It's not like you know, a swim bait bite or something like that. You feel that dunk, they might just have the last 2/3 of that worm tail, right? You have a 12-inch bait down there, they might be biting right behind the hook. So feel that dunk, and then give them a second, let them engulf that whole worm, reel down, check that there's resistance, then reel down and set. You don't want to give them some time to get that worm in their mouth. That way you can hook them in the roof of the mouth and not come back with 2/3 of your worm missing, and all you have is the plastic right behind your hook point. So hopefully that helps, guys. I know it's a little longer video, but summertime worming is so much fun. You know, if you need to, slow down. If you can't get them on the reaction stuff, these worms right here will put fish in the boat, depending on the way you're fishing them, the different techniques. But if you love worm fishing, go out and start off with a worm. I know Matt and I did a video probably a few years back now. We went out and our goal was to catch 100 fish. We did it all on the trick worm and the T-Mac, summertime fishing on Clear Lake, on shaky heads, and we had a blast. We caught some good fish, I think up to like 6 or 7 pounds. But worm fishing, summertime, it's hot out. Don't be afraid to go out. Don't be afraid to slow down and really pick those key areas apart. And throwing those bigger worms is going to eliminate some of those smaller fish and hopefully get you guys a new PB. If you guys have any questions, please leave those down below in the comment section. I will try to get to those as soon as possible. As always, guys, we appreciate you. Thanks for watching. If you learned something from this video or enjoyed this video, please give us a like. That really helps our channel with the algorithm. And remember to subscribe. We do 3 videos a week, sometimes 5 or 6 videos a week, to help you guys learn more, catch more, and bigger bass. Again, we appreciate you guys. Have a good one.